Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening for this segment on human resources. In talking with Patty, I'm going to cover a lot of different areas, getting into recruiting, but a lot of things that lead up to that, and then some things that are after that. So just really quickly, just so I get a sense of where everybody is who's on the call, maybe if we can just take a quick moment and you can tell me your name and what business you have and whether or not you have employees currently, because that'll help me gauge some of the conversation. Holly, you want to start with you? Everyone will have to unmute for a moment. Okay, you might have to change your speaker. While she does that, Sarah, why don't we jump over to you real quick?
Okay, hi, I'm Sarah Yost, and I'm a co-owner of a large daycare center in Atascadero,
Okay.
child care center in Atascadero, and we do have employees currently.
You do. I'm sure you do.
Yeah.
Okay, Gabby, how about you? And Gabby's with Mission Community. Okay.
Right, that's correct.
Yeah. Holly, do we have sound yet? Can you hear us? You can hear us.
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Okay.
I didn't have my microphone plugged in, but I'm Holly Gillen, and I'm the new program coordinator at the Women's Business Center in San Luis Obispo.
Okay, good. So let's get started then. What I have is, again, I'm going to go through kind of a spectrum of human resources, touching on the areas that when I was talking to Patricia, is that, we know generally when businesses are starting up or when they may already have some employees, but still a little bit new at it. There's a lot of things that can either be overlooked or done wrong, or sometimes you just get, you talk to your neighbor and bookkeeper or whoever, and maybe some of the information that you've gotten isn't quite correct. I've done human resource management for 37 years. I have a very, very deep background in that, as well as kind of overlapping that with a lot of consulting that I do for my clients, beyond just the human resources. So I think I bring a pretty good background for the kind of information that we're going to go through today. So again, I'm going to give kind of an overview of things that you want to think about before you're going to hire somebody, then through that hiring process, and a few kind of follow-up things at the end. And through here, I'll also give you some resources that you can have. I've embedded in here also some websites and things, and we'll make sure you get a copy of the presentation so you have that information to take away with you. So before you get into recruiting for the position, I want to touch on this particular area of independent contractor versus employee. This is an area that I see new businesses that come to me and look for consulting quite often have made a significant mistake. So an independent contractor is somebody that you say, look, I don't want to be the employer. I don't want to have to worry about payroll taxes and insurance and all those things. So I'm just going to make them a contractor. Even more removed from that is the situation where somebody says, I'm not even going to call them a contractor. I'm just going to pay them cash under the table and pretend that they don't really work here in my business. And that poses even more risk. So either of those situations can be a problem because of what we have in California called the ABC test. Under that very, very rigid test, it's the most stringent in the company. Somebody is an employee of your business if they're performing services, unless you can meet what's called this ABC test. They have to be free from your direction and control. You can't tell them what hours to work. You can't tell them how to do their job. You can't have them clock in and out. The second one is what they're doing has to be outside your normal scope of business. So Sarah, for example, for your child care center, providing the services of taking care of the children is a core part of what your business is. So you wouldn't be able to say, it's outside the normal part of my work. Now, if you hire a bookkeeping firm, for example, or an accounting firm or a marketing firm, that might meet that if they meet the other prongs of the test, because that's not your usual course of business. And they have to be regularly engaged in providing that kind of service for other businesses. They can't be doing it just for you. So again, a bookkeeping firm, a marketing firm, I have both of those. And those are legitimately independent contractors. Okay, so it's really important to take a look at this assessment. And if someone is saying to you, oh, you should just hire them as contractors, come back to this and really take a look at it, because there is a downside. The downside is if you get caught misclassifying, you end up having to pay the retroactive payroll taxes that you should have paid, plus the amount that should have been paid by the employee from their payroll check. You get hit with both of them. Okay, so it's really important to not do that. And I put here, don't take up guidance from friends, because most of the time when I have talked to people, they said, well, I was talking to my neighbor who's a business person, and he said, this is just what I should do. That may be, they've gotten away with it, but I will tell you that what happens is, if that relationship goes bad and you end it, that person, if they go and try to file for unemployment, they're going to say they were unemployed because they want unemployment benefits. Or they're going to file and claim a workers' comp. They're going to say, I was injured at work and I wasn't provided work comp. Either of those can bring a claim, and it will bring the state in and auditing your business. And I have a former client now who legitimately had a number of people, drivers that were independent contractors, and they're going through a massive state audit now. And it's very time consuming and expensive to go through. So don't get yourself into that situation, okay? The next thing for planning ahead is taking a look at and understanding what your real cost of having employees is. And so there's a number of things you have to take into account. One is, we have not only a statewide minimum wage, there are also a lot of jurisdictions that have their own. And so depending on where your employees are working, now, most here on the Central Coast, we don't have a separate minimum wage than the states, but I have the, Berkeley does this amazing work of compiling all of the statewide minimum wages. So San Diego, Berkeley, San Francisco, lots of cities and counties have their own, and they will be higher than the state. So you have to comply with that over, it's always what is the highest wage, not the lowest. And so, for example, here in California, we're higher than the federal minimum wage, which, believe it or not, is still at like $7.25 an hour, versus in California, we're at 16. So that's what you have to pay unless you're in a city or a county that has a higher rate. And it's important to understand what that is, because if you don't pay that correctly, you could have, again, a retroactive liability for making up that pay difference, along with penalties if you have a wage and hour issue. So always take a look at that. But then if it's $16 an hour is your minimum wage, and we'll talk in a little bit about whether that's competitive or not, you also have to factor on payroll taxes and workers' comp. Now you'll see I put here a range of 15 to roughly 30%. That's because the workers' comp premium that you're going to pay can vary greatly. So my office staff are really inexpensive because it's clerical. There's not much of a risk. Versus you, Sarah, in childcare, you're paying a lot more than I'm paying, because your employees are very subject to having lifting injuries from bending and lifting children, right? They can have other injuries. They can trip and fall when they're, playing with the kids, those kinds of things. Versus a roofer, for example, a lot of construction work is much, much higher. And so that range, you have to understand what that is. And if you don't have workers' comp insurance yet, one of the first things you would be looking to when you're going to hire somebody is contact your business broker that does your other business insurance, your general liability, whatever you have. They usually will also do what's called property casualty. They'll be able to get you a quote for work comp. When you start out with workers' comp, if you've never had it before, you're likely going to end up with the state's program with the state compensation insurance fund. And that's actually not a bad deal. They're very competitive. They're very systematic. We find them actually really good and easy to work. And we work with State Fund with a lot of our clients. Okay. So that's an important piece of it, because you're not just thinking about the direct wage you're going to pay the employee. You have to think of those additional costs that you're going to incur for processing the payroll. Okay. If you have not paid employees before, you also have to make sure you probably already have your federal tax ID number. Depending on how your business is organized, it's either your social security number or what's called an FEIN, a federal employer identification number. What you probably have not already gotten is the state tax number that you get from EDD, the Employment Development Department. And you can go online with edd.ca.gov and get that. Okay. It's like we have someone joining in for a moment. Okay. The other thing is to think about expense reimbursements. So this is something that really gets overlooked by new business owners. We have a labor code in California called Labor Code 2802. That's the code section. Effectively, what it means is that any expenses that your employees incur in the course of doing their work, you have an obligation to reimburse them. So, for example, most of my employees have to use their cell phone now because there's so many websites that we use that they have to get an authentication code, and it goes to their cell phone. And things like that. So I have an obligation. I have to pay a cell phone stipend to my employees to cover that expense. If your employees have to run to the bank for you or do other errands, you need to reimburse them their mileage for using their personal vehicle, unless you're going to hand them your keys and it's your company car and you're going to have them drive yours. So anything that they incur in the course of their work, you have to reimburse them for that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, could I actually ask a question on that?
Absolutely, please.
We're required to have one person on site at a time that's CPR certified, but our business require all staff to be CPR certified. So this business has actually been around for 31 years. My sister and I just purchased it in 2022. So we're kind of new to the ownership, but we've worked here for a long time. So the previous owner always paid 50% of their CPR. So no, we have to pay the whole amount. Okay.
Because you're requiring it for them, you need to be paying it. I would guess that the idea was that, well, if I pay to get them certified and then they leave and go someplace else, but you're requiring it. So that is something that they have to have. Therefore, you need to pay.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
With mileage, if you have to pay mileage, the easiest thing to do, and you can always check Google IRS.gov and what the current mileage reimbursement rate. The easiest way to reimburse mileage is to pay employees the IRS reimbursable rate per mile. There's other complicated ways to do it. It requires a lot more tracking. The IRS rate is what's called a safe harbor. As long as you're paying that for every mile, I mean, I don't remember now what it is. It's about 57 cents a mile. But whatever that is, that's sufficient for both California and federal views. Okay. So the next thing that I want to touch on, because again, I think that it's very, very important, is as you're getting ready to hire, or you, Sarah, as you've come in and you've bought this business and you basically have inherited a whole bunch of employees. It's an opportunity for you also, as you're still fairly new into it, to really be looking at and evaluating what's the kind of culture that you want in that business. And I will tell you that pre-COVID, we'd already started a real cycle of that with the Me Too movement. And then COVID has exacerbated that. My recruiter regularly gets asked questions when she's talking to candidates who are wanting to know, what's this company like? What's this company's reputation? How do they treat employees? And your candidates are going out and they're Googling and they're looking for reviews and feedback. They go to Glassdoor, they go to other places to look at what kind of feedback is there about this company. And I think that it's really important to give a lot of thought to that. I wouldn't say there's no right or wrong, because I think there are some negative bad cultures. But there's not just one way to do that, and to say, for example, the classic is in the tech industry that everybody can kind of do what they want and have a lot of freedom. Well, in some of my clients, for example, that are science-based, lab-based, they don't have that latitude. They really have to be very, very tight and rigid about following procedures. But there's other ways that they can make a very welcoming, warm, inclusive environment and how they interact and behave with employees. For example, we deal with this a lot where a supervisor hasn't got real great supervising skills and they will yell at an employee in front of their coworkers. Think about how that makes somebody feel. And, even if you are really frustrated with somebody, if you do that in front of everybody, you're setting up an expectation with people that they're on pins and needles, that they're really uncomfortable, that they don't think well of their interactions with the company and with their supervisors. Whereas if you take them behind closed doors and have a private conversation when you're not angry and say, let's talk about this situation, it sets a very different kind of a culture and a tone for everybody. So I put this in here because I deal so often with the effects when it's not a good culture. And for you, what that leads to is you will have a lot of turnover because people will come in and they're not going to stay. We also see in the recruiting process very, very often, if the image of your company that you're presenting in the interview and you talk about what you do and how you do it doesn't match up when they get there, they're not going to stay. Okay. So this is something to really give a lot of thought to. And if you don't have knowledge and skills and how to develop that, Mission Community Services Corp, I'm sure, can help develop some of that, help you understand some of that, but it's really important to do. Okay. So again, before you get out and start recruiting, I want to touch on what's a job description versus a job posting. A job description is what you're going to use to identify all of the various responsibilities that you want this person to do. Now, when you do that, there are some tools that are out there. For example, if you go online, you do ONET online, there's a lot of already built job descriptions for you that will say, if you have a childcare, teacher level 1, it'll give you a lot of the typical job duties of that description, or a receptionist, or whatever else it is that you need. And the nice thing is it will also give you what are the normal physical requirements, what kind of abilities does someone have to have. You can build a pretty robust job description by using that particular tool from ONET. So then the job posting is where you want to take a lot of those duties and the core responsibilities, but then add something on the front of it that talks about your company, why someone should look at your business and consider coming to work for you. And just because you're a small business doesn't mean that there aren't great things that you can post about that, either training opportunities, opportunities for someone if the business is new, but it's planning for a lot of growth. You can say those kinds of things. You just want to make sure that you're not promising that this is where it will go. Okay. The other thing is, quite often new businesses have the idea that they can just hire somebody and put them on quote salary. There are very, very specific rules in both California and at the federal level for someone to be what's called exempt. If someone is exempt, that means that they are exempt and you don't have to pay overtime after 8 hours a day. You don't have to worry about meal and rest periods, those kinds of things. However, nobody is exempt at a baseline level unless they are making a salary of at least 2 times the minimum wage. So you're already at $65,000, $66,000. Most small businesses are usually, unless you're in tech or some higher level, you're not starting a new person at that level. So you're not even getting to the exempt threshold. And some of my medical practices and things, the doctors have to be at like $95 an hour. Software companies have to pay a much higher minimum wage also. So you don't even get to the exempt level until you get to that. And then there's very, very detailed descriptions of the scope of work that they need to be doing. Okay. So again, if you are thinking about that, and again, don't talk to your neighbor or bookkeeper, because that's where, again, where I keep seeing that people go wrong is someone said, oh, just pay them a salary. You can pay a quote salary, but they're non-exempt. You still have to track their time. And if they work more than 8 hours in a day and then 40 hours in a week, you're paying them overtime. You have to make sure that they have a rest period, 10 minutes for every 4 hours of work, and that they have to take a lunch break no more than by the start of the 5th hour. And if they don't have either of those, you owe them an extra hour pay for that day. It's a self-imposed penalty for not complying with those things. Okay. So you'll find some of this at the DLSC FAQs that I gave you on one. There's some overtime exemptions. And then also with the DLSC, they have a lot of basic wage and hour guidance there that you can go to and look for. But overtime is the key. It's 8 hours a day in California. It's not 40 hours a week, which is the federal standard. Okay. And that's, again, quite often a mistake. So the other things that I think you want to plan ahead for are always how are you going to onboard that person? Onboarding means how are you going to go about getting all of their mandatory paperwork completed, introduce them to your business. I always like to have a training plan. We have, in fact, a new employee that started today. We have an actual planner that has very, very structured training, because even if it's your first employee, if you expect them to come in and just follow you around and somehow grasp and understand everything you're needing them to do, it's likely going to fail, or you're going to get frustrated because they're not retaining stuff because they're trying to get it hit and miss. So as hard as it is, you need to plan some time to sit with them, hopefully without interruptions, as much as possible, and try to give them as much concentrated training as you can. And I get it. It's really hard to do that when you're running a very, very small business. But recognize that if you can put some time to that, you're going to start off the relationship much stronger and have less frustration by everybody and less likelihood of that person leaving. Okay. A lot of us have had to deal with over the last several years, and you may. Now, Sarah, for example, your employees are going to have to be on site. There's nothing they're going to be able to do unless it's somebody doing admin clerical work that might pose, hey, I'd really love to do this, but I'd like to work at home. There is no obligation to allow people to work from home. You can say, I don't want hybrid or remote work. That's perfectly okay. With some roles, it might limit your candidate pool, but the further we get out from COVID, the more and more we're seeing people with back to an understanding that remote work really isn't going to be that readily available anymore. So fortunately, it's not as huge a deal as it was even a couple of years ago. So the next one is understanding what employment laws are applicable to your business. So there are a lot of them. This is if you have one person. This is a sampling of the laws that are going to apply with one employee. So for an example, Cal Savers. The state of California now requires that every employer make a retirement plan available to their employees. You don't have to fund anything to it, but you have to make it available for employees to put their own deferrals into for their plan. The easiest thing when you're really, really small is to use the state plan with CalSavers. Okay. It is a Roth, so employees can't defer as much as if it was a 401k qualified retirement plan, but it's a really good, inexpensive way to get this set up. I've got some clients who were on CalSavers. The employees go on, they sign up for it. The client then turns around and takes that deduction from employees and then funds it into CalSavers. So it's an easy way to do it. You have to have an illness and injury prevention plan. That's the IIPP. CalOSHA, which is the state agency that governs safety in the workplace, actually provides a really nice template. It's really easy to go on their website, pull their IIPP template, and follow the instructions and add all the information in. Who's going to be your safety person? And most of the time, it's probably going to be you in the sizes that you are. And then if you have workers' comp and you have that with a broker, many, many times, like a Morrison Garitano in San Luis, they have qualified loss control staff who can look at that plan with you and give you some guidance. Okay. Fair employment and housing is discrimination. The I-9 is where you have to fill out a form and verify someone's right to work in the United States. That's one of your onboarding documents. There's lots of wage and hour laws. That's what I was talking about, overtime, meal periods, and you're going to find all of that with the DLSE's website. Every employer in California, when you hire somebody, there's a form that you have to basically report those employees to EDD. What they're doing with that, and they've done it for probably 15 or 20 years now, they match that new hire up with outstanding garnishments for child support. So what will happen is when you do that new hire reporting, you may suddenly get a garnishment order that says this person has an obligation to be paying child support, and you have to withhold this amount and send it to this state agency. You cannot avoid that. It is absolutely required by law for you to comply with that. And if an employee comes to you and says, I don't want you to do it, you cannot say no. You have to do it. They need to go talk to their attorney and try to get the garnishment abated in some way. But if it's their child support amount, you have to do that. So don't ever allow an employee to talk you into not doing the garnishment, because if you do, they can come after you for the amount that you failed to withhold from the employee. Okay. Paid family leave is a tax that you're going to do if you use a payroll service or someone, they will do that. But more importantly is to understand in California, we also now have required paid sick leave. Okay. And again, that's all at the DLSE website that will help you know. Cal Chamber is also a phenomenally good resource for businesses to understand basic wage and hour, okay, and a lot of these various laws. So they have a lot of forms on their website and things for you. Okay. Any questions on that so far? So now let's get to, you've kind of done a lot of this pre-work and you want to get to starting to post. I've put a few tips here. I have a recruiter. I have a really, really talented recruiter. So where we post jobs is Indeed. We get lots of clients who come and say, hey, I've been posting on Craigslist and I'm just not getting anything. Personally, we don't find Craigslist effective at all. I do have some clients who have found it for very entry level people. If you need people that don't have a lot of skills, Craigslist might work. But we find a lot of hackers on Craigslist, and we find a lot of people who will apply for anything that just don't have the skills that are being asked for. So we don't find that effective. If you have a LinkedIn profile, it's really expensive. You can post on LinkedIn, but we typically find a regular posting, unless you're paying thousands like we do to have what's called a recruiter seat, you're going to pay $1,500 and up. Usually that's way too expensive. for really small businesses. So I would encourage you to look at Indeed. The other thing is when you're going to start recruiting, there's lots of software tools that are out there. There's lots of recruiting platforms. The one we use that I find the most effective is called Hiring Thing. And I gave you their link there because with Hiring Thing, it's very inexpensive and you can do a free trial with them. The advantage of Hiring Thing is not only do they maintain all of your candidates, so you have all your data, who applied, why you didn't consider them, you can keep all your notes and stuff in there. But when you post a job with them, it goes out to about 35 free sites that Hiring Thing contracts with. So you get a lot of visibility for really, really small amount of investment in that platform. And so particularly as you grow your employees, you want to have some way. You don't want to be back using paper pencil, trying to have people fill out applications and stuff. You'll be buried in paperwork before you know it. And because you have to keep in mind, if you post a position, you need to keep the applications of everybody who applied for 3 years. Because somebody could come back and say, hey, Holly, I applied for that position and I think I was qualified and you didn't consider me. I'm filing a discrimination complaint. If they do that, you're going to have to be able to show everybody that applied and why you didn't consider that one person versus the people that you did. Okay. So Hiring Thing will capture all of that. Yes, Sarah.
So if like we use Indeed regularly, anybody that applies on there, if we don't respond to them, do we have to keep information?
I would, absolutely.
Okay. And even if they haven't filled anything out, we just need to keep information that they did apply.
Yes, because they're responding to your ad. So
Okay.
them posting a resume to you is really them applying.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I would keep all of that information. And what we do with Hiring Thing, for example, is when we get someone who comes to us through Indeed, we pull them over into Hiring Thing. So we track all their candidate stuff there because that has an ability for you to rate each of the candidates and again, put notes. You can communicate with them through it. So all of that is captured in that platform. Okay.
That's great.
So for you particularly, Sarah, with where you are, it's really something you should take a look at.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
So the other thing is I say resume versus a California compliant application. First, don't just buy an application that you get from Staples or something, because quite often they are not tailored for California. In California, for example, you can't ask about criminal history on the application, and you can't ask salary history. Those are illegal in California. And we still see clients that are using applications that they got online or they got at an office supply place that's not tailored for California. What I don't want you to do is you can let people apply with a resume, but always before you consider them and make an offer, make them fill out an application. What do you think is different about the two things? Sarah, you've done hiring. What do you see on an application versus a resume?
Oh, well, the application, has their schooling where the resume might not, their experience that they haven't listed there.
Right. Yeah.
I'm not sure what else, but so you said you can't ask about criminal history, or what did you say about the salary that you can't ask?
You can't ask for salary. You can't ask somebody in their prior positions, what was your salary?
And actually that brought up another question my sister and I were wondering about. If you can you ask for a person's age or their birth date?
No.
So
no.
how does that work with us? They have to be 18.
You're in a different thing. You can have on the application that this position requires that you be at least 18 years of age. You can just have that and have them say, yes, I am. Because
So
you have an overlapping state requirements for the certifications to be in childcare.
Perfect.
There are sometimes some differences. Okay.
Okay.
And you're going to have to have, they're going to have fingerprints checked. They're going to have to go through that whole process. And so you can disclose that up ahead of time and say, this is going to require these things. Okay. But the resume, everybody, most people puff up the resume. They usually kind of have general dates of employments. They might say, 2021 to 2023. You need more specifics. And on an application, you're looking for that. What's the month and the year? So you're looking for gaps in employment. You're looking on an application of, it'll have the question, what was the reason for leaving this job? Nobody ever tells you that on the resume.
Yeah.
So there's things there that are helpful to look at. And so that's why I always want clients to get an application. You can do a first check screening on a resume, but always in your process, make sure that you get that.
Got it.
And lastly, you need to make sure that the way you treat one candidate is the same that you treat all candidates. Okay, so basic interview questions, I would develop those for each of your kind of positions and have standard ones. That doesn't mean if somebody says something that you can't ask a follow-up question based on what they said, but the core of what you're asking and doing in the process is the same way. In California also now, we cannot check criminal checks, credit checks until after an offer of employment has been made. So you make an offer and you always say, my offer is contingent upon successful completion of all of the background checks that we need to do. So you're covering yourself that way, but you can't do it beforehand. Okay. And what do you think is the process if something comes back on a criminal check that you think is a problem? Can you just say to the person, I'm not considering you any longer?
I have no idea. I mean, I guess you'd have to tell them that they're no longer, I can't even think of the word.
Yeah. You actually can't jump to that step yet. In California, it's actually federal law under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. There are very stringent rules. You have to go back and you have to give that person feedback and an opportunity to correct maybe misinformation with a credit reporting company. There is a legal process that has to be gone through. It's called an adverse action notice that you have to give them. If you're doing any kind of background checks, the service that you're using should be able to give you those forms, whether it's a credit check and credit checks are very limited on who can do it. But in your case, for example, Sarah, you've got to be doing criminal checks. Now, again, some of those are going to come through LiveScan, and they will guide you on the correct process for that.
Okay, that's great.
Okay. And I talked about having prepared interview questions and treating everyone the same. So once you've got somebody hired, you're going to do what we call as onboarding. You're going to bring them on either their very first day of employment, or what a lot of businesses are doing now is they may be using a payroll platform that they trigger onboarding early before their first day. If you do that, you have to pay them the time that they spend filling out their new hire paperwork. In other words, you can't trigger it early and think, oh, I don't have to pay for that. They're going to sit on their own time and fill out their employment paperwork. That's on you. So most smaller businesses just give it to somebody on their first day of employment and have them sit down and go through that document. You have to have a W-4. The California version of tax withholding is the DE-4 and an I-9. The I-9 is that verifying that someone has a legal right to work in the United States. The form goes through and identifies for you what kind of documents you can look for and how you have to fill it out on the form. Okay. So you want to make sure that you have those things ready ahead of time, and you can pull them off of the various websites that are out there for those. Pretty easy to do. The next is you need to figure out, if you've never had employees, how are you going to process payroll? Most small businesses have their bookkeeper for their business do it. So if you have QuickBooks, for example, QuickBooks has an ability and it's really efficient to do payroll. And it'll process the taxes for you. It'll make the tax payments. It'll do all of that process. So you want to think about how you're going to do that. Okay. There are certain requirements in California that must be on your employee's check stub. And literally, there are law firms that look for mistakes on that file suit and will look for penalties because literally you didn't tell somebody what their sick balance is on their check stub, or you didn't have all of their pay codes listed for them clearly, or you didn't give it to them on time. So you want to be sure that you're looking at all of those things. And again, when you're brand new with this, if again, most smaller bookkeepers will use QuickBooks, go to your bookkeeper, but check that bookkeeper and make sure what kind of training and education they've had to be sure that they're giving you the right payroll. I still come across bookkeepers that have been doing bookkeeping for years, and they're telling a client that they don't have to pay overtime till 40 hours. Okay. Or, that they don't need to pay a meal period unless an employee asks for it. That's not how it works. Okay. So you just need to have some caution there on who you're using. Okay. As I said, when it comes to compliance, Google is not your friend. And I say this to my own staff all the time. Okay, you went out, you researched this. Where did you find the information? I actually have for my team a list of allowed resources that we go and we rely on to look for information, because there's lots of stuff out there when you Google that is not accurate at all. And so you want to be really careful. I look for reputable law firms. I look for Cal Chamber. I look for state agency websites. Those are the things you want to be looking to, not something that just looks like, for example, a plaintiff's attorney website that's throwing up all kinds of bells and whistles and that kind of thing. So be really careful what you're relying on. Okay. So a few things here that are what I call best practices. These are not things that are required unless, for example, Sarah and Holly, you may have the same thing of some requirements based on what you're doing of background checks. As I mentioned earlier, those are very restricted in California. Credit checks, for example, could only be done if you can really demonstrate that this person is going to have access to, for example, your bank accounts, to the bank account information of your employees, to their social security numbers and date of birth, that would give someone access to the full spectrum of identification information on people. So it's really limited on where you can do those credit checks. Criminal checks you can do. We no longer can verify anything on marijuana use. And again, there's real restrictions. You can't, and it's becoming harder and harder in California. I have a feeling the way the legislature is moving, we're likely going to be moving away from any ability to even do background checks until after somebody's been hired, which frankly, at that point, it's a little moot, but you probably do want to know if you have somebody that was convicted of embezzlement, for example, is not somebody you want having access to your bank account or to cash that might be coming into your business. So if particularly there's either cash handling or you have people who are interacting with the public, I would be concerned about that if there is anything in their recent background of assault and battery, for example. So you have to weigh what that background is compared to the nature of position you're going to have them in. So you can't always say no. I had a situation a number of years ago, for example, where when I did a background check, I had somebody who had actually gone to prison for theft. And the kind of position that we were thinking of this person for, the opening that we had, he was going to be the only night warehouse person in a warehouse full of expensive merchandise. In that case, I could make the argument there is a direct correlation to the nature of conviction that this person had, to the scope of work that they're doing. But then I had somebody else who had a conviction for murder. It had been years before. He'd been out of jail for a number of years, and he'd had very successful employment successively with prior employers and never another issue again. It was a situation where he was caught up in a gang when he was a youth. He was, like a 40-year-old adult now. There was no nexus to what he did years ago to where he was today. And we hired him and never had a problem. Now, again, when you've got childcare overlapping, you're going to follow your state guidelines for that. Okay. An employee handbook. My caveat with this will be, you don't have to have an employee handbook, and I would rather you not have one at all than to have one that's poorly drafted. If you don't draft it properly with the right kind of guidance and advice, don't have it. Because you can create far more liability for yourself and far more problems by having a bad handbook than by not having one at all. Okay. Either you're using a good employment attorney, those are very expensive. You can go to Cal Chamber. Cal Chamber actually has a tool that you can use that's relatively inexpensive, and go through that and it'll guide you. And it will say, if you're this size business, this law doesn't apply to you. You don't need to put it in there. Okay. But don't go in and start editing what they give you. So if there's a leave section, for example, on pregnancy leave, don't go in and say, well, I don't really like this. I don't want to have to do this. Don't start editing the policies. Those policies are drafted by employment law attorneys. I have a platform that I use for that. We do drafting, but only because we know exactly how to do that. If you don't know it, use the templates as they have them. That will at least be far better than going out and finding something, again, Google, that's not a qualified handbook. Okay. And one of the keys with that is it's giving you the policies based on your number of employees. Because remember, I said there are some things that apply when you're one. There's other laws that will attach when you reach 5 employees and 15 employees and 25 employees and 50 and 100. So as your business may grow, you're going to have different laws that are going to attach to you. And when you're really small, there's a lot fewer. Unfortunately, it's not like there's none. There's still a lot, but it's not as many. Okay. Your employee record keeping. You need to keep all of your, again, we already talked about the hiring stuff, but when you have employees also, you're going to be keeping a personnel file. That I-9 document, the verifying right to work, should never be kept in the personnel file. Okay. The reason you don't want to do that is if DHS shows up in your workplace to do an inspection, you're going to have 3 days to pull all of the documents. And if they're in personnel files, it's going to be really difficult. You do not want to give them access to your personnel files. You want your I-9 documents kept in a separate folder. So you can always pull those, readily have them available. And I'll tell you, I learned my lesson with that 25 years ago when I had, it was the old INS that showed up then at a client site, and I had 72 hours to pull about 300 documents and go through and audit them and make sure they were right before we turned them over. But it's just a good practice to start out. HIPAA considerations. If you're making notes about an employee that came and talked to you about a medical situation they have and why they need time off work, be really careful what you're putting in those notes that goes into their personnel folder, because HIPAA is a law that basically shields privacy of medical information. So if you've got medical information about an employee, that comes back because somebody's had a work comp injury or something, I'd keep those out of the personnel file. That stuff goes in separate files. Okay. It shouldn't be part of a personnel file. And lastly, documentation. This is critical. And what you should do is come up with how you want to document information for your employees. Until you get large enough that you may have Paylocity or Paychecks or some platform that might have some tools for you. You may go and just start a Word document and save a different Word document for each employee. And you're going to go in and you're going to say today's date, your name, and put notes about an issue that you had with the employee today, a performance discussion that you had with them. It's just a simple way of maintaining some basic notes so that when you get 6 months from now and are saying, I want to terminate this person, you've got all that documentation that goes back and it supports that termination. And I will tell you that I've had times where a client comes to me and says, Sandra, I want to terminate this person. Well, wait a minute. You just gave them a really great performance review a month ago. I have no documentation in their personnel file. What happened? And if they don't have anything and they just say, well, you know, I've been talking to them for months. Well, you did this performance review 30 days ago and you didn't address any of these issues. So now, as of 30 days ago, all that prior stuff, it's in the past. You don't get to rely on it anymore because you didn't document it. So again, there's lots of ways that you want to make sure that you are maintaining kind of a running chronology of information. And old school, simple way, and until you have a platform of some kind to, do it with a little more bells and whistles. An easy thing is to create a Word document, save it, per person, and just keep a running chronology of notes so that you know, because you will not remember always every little thing that happened. And sometimes when you go back and look at that, because you've had a problem with one of your employees, you go back, you look and say, oh, of course, I forgot about these other things. This has been happening more regularly than I thought it was. Okay. So then you have more of a foundation for taking some kind of an action. Okay. Last thing, job descriptions are also not required, but they are a good idea. What the job description does is it says to an employee, here's what I expect you to do in this position. Here's the general duties that you're going to perform. What you're also going to identify is here's what's essential and here's what's non-essential. What the non-essential is important for is you have the ability to say, look, if you have a disability of some kind and need to be accommodated, the essential functions are the things that I've already determined have to be able to be done with or without accommodation. If you can't do those things, we may not be able to accommodate. Okay, so you have the ability to make that assessment. And what you always want to put when you have your whole list of duties of all the things the person is going to do, you always have the additional bullet that says other duties as assigned. That's the catch-all. So your employee doesn't come back when you ask them to do something that's not on the regular list, but you need some help doing something or you need them to help a coworker. Other duties as assigned means anything else that we ask you to do. Okay. And so most of the time, most employees are wanting to help out and willing, but I've had some that come back and they want to go over and they want to nitpick with their supervisor that job description. So it's a good idea to have that other duties, and that's what you point to, is whatever else might be necessary for the effective operations of the business. Okay. And I gave you the ONET, and I mentioned ONET earlier in the presentation. Here's your link for that. This is where you can find all those job duties and physical needs and abilities that somebody may have to have. And the reason I like to use ONET is when you go to that, if you ever got questioned about, why do you say that this job requires regular bending, lifting, and stooping, being able to pick up a 25-pound or 35-pound child, for example, all day. So Sarah, you're going to be able to point to ONET as a government source that provided that information. Because what they've done is they have aggregated across all companies, and these are the common abilities, attributes, physical requirements, job duties of this kind of a position. So that's a really good source to be able to point back to. Okay. So a few final thoughts. I always want to be careful that this kind of presentation doesn't scare you off from having employees. There's a lot of great things about it. I have 25. I love having employees, and I love the interaction of them all. And, you know, I couldn't do the business that I do without the people that I have. You can't grow your business because all of us have a maximum capacity of what we're able to do in a day, right? And if you want to be able to grow that business, you're going to have employees. So don't let these HR things scare you off from that. Just go into it knowing this information and how to do it right. And then you have far fewer problems. You have far less frustrations. I won't say that you won't ever have any, because we all, I mean, that's the life cycle of having employees. Sometimes things happen and you have frustrations with some, but it can be really exciting as you're growing it. But that's where you want to make sure that you're managing that liability as much as you possibly can. And again, get the expert advice. Talk to people that you know are qualified. You can always reach out to me if it's something that Patricia and her staff at Mission Community don't know on an HR question. Just email me. Tell me that in the email you were on this presentation. I'm happy to answer quick questions. And my email is sandra@ypp.com, and it'll be on the PowerPoint presentation. Okay. And the time and money spent initially to do it right can save your business. So I don't want to see you get into that situation where I've had clients. I'll give you an example. A couple years ago, client, her supervisor knew that an employee, somebody had come back to work, it was a rehire, knew that the person had been working, but had not clocked in on the timekeeping system. And instead of estimating the hours like she was supposed to, she just didn't pay her, didn't report any hours for her. That $300 in unpaid wages was $3,500 in the waiting time and penalties for that late payment of wages to the employee, because the employee waited the 30 days to get the maximum penalties that they could get from the state. So that's where it's so important to do it right. Okay. And that's all I have. Any other questions?
I actually do. At the very beginning, you talked about the cell phone use and the cell phone stipend. So we're finding more and more our staff do have to use cell phones. How do you figure out what to pay?
Yeah, that's the challenge, let me say, because effectively you have to pay what the actual cost of the employee's cell phone usage for business is. The reality is everybody's got different service plans. It's all over the place on what their cost is. So what I do is I come up with a stipend, and I say, based on what I believe your average use is, I'm going to pay you $50 a month, or $25 a pay period, or $10 a pay period. If you don't believe that that is enough to cover the cost of your cell phone use for business, let me know. And what they have to produce then is their cell phone bill, so that you can verify and have some way of proving up that this person really is using it a lot more and they have a really expensive plan of some kind, and come up with what that amount is. But almost everybody, I've never had an employee say, I don't think that's enough. Most people have pretty reasonable costs nowadays for their cell phone usage.
And so that wouldn't include like calling out sick for work, they're using their phone. Wouldn't include something like that, right? It's just purely.
It's purely work.
Okay.
Right? Because calling in sick is, they should be using their own phone.
Right.
And if they're
Right.
using their cell phone, they're not at work at that
Right.
point. They're calling in
Okay.
sick and calling out.
Okay.
Okay.
And would you, if you paid that stipend, do you pay it through payroll? How does that work then?
Yes, I do. I do it as a reimbursement on payroll. So they know that, I'm going to stop sharing here for a moment. They know that on their check, each time they're going to have an amount that is reimbursement. We call it expense or reimbursement on their check stub. And then it isn't subject to taxes, to payroll taxes.
It is not.
No.
Okay. Okay, great.
Yeah,
That
because
was
it's a
my question.
reimbursement. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you were paying them like a car allowance
Mhm.
instead of the mileage, that could be subject to payroll taxes.
Mhm. Okay, that's great. Thank you. This was really
welcome.
helpful.
Oh, good. Holly, did you have any particular questions? You've been real quiet.
I didn't have any questions, but that was really great information. Thank you.
Good. You're welcome. All right, good. Well,
That was
thank
great,
you.
Sandra. Thank you so much for your help. That was cool.
Good, good, good. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll make sure you get a copy of the presentation. And again, feel free to reach to me at Sandra at YPP if you have some basic questions. I'm happy to answer those.